Welcome to another video in our Intelitek series. In this video I'd like to go through the process of installing a single acting air vise into your machine. So let's go ahead and take a better look at some of the components. This static jaw, when you take a look at it, it can actually be installed upside down pretty easily. So I want to make sure that you can tell the top from the bottom. At least on mine, I have one side where the counter bore is much deeper, or the slot is deeper on one side than the other. The deep slot goes up for the bolts to go through, so they don't have to be quite so long. So typically, this static or non-movable jaw is going to be in your back left corner. Your movable jaw then will be in your front right corner. So this is the basic idea of how this works. We're going to mount this jaw to the table as square as we can. So this non-movable jaw is where we're going to locate our material. So once our material is inside here, the idea is when I activate the vise, this is going to extend out at a 45 degree and it's going to come in contact with my material. Now I already have this extended out, so the idea is it should come into contact with my material kind of like that. The big deal is I want to be able to touch both of these sides so that I'm pushing it into this corner. And that's easier said than done. So I want to try to have pressure in both the X and the Y. One of the limitations of a single acting vise is what happens when I change the size of the material. And now all of a sudden I've got a 3x3. This one can typically stay in place, and now I'm going to have to move this jaw. So this jaw is no longer in place anymore, so I'm going to have to relocate this jaw into another location so it'll actually squeeze my part. So that's one of the big limitations. So here's another limitation. Say I'm cutting these things by hand. So the raw stock is my responsibility. It's supposed to be a 3x3, but instead I accidentally cut it at a 3x2 7/8. You wouldn't think that it's really that big a deal that this is 1/8 of an inch too small. But now unfortunately, in whichever direction it's too small, I'm not going to be coming into contact with both jaws. So I might be squeezing here and not squeezing here. I will get some pressure, but not an ideal amount of pressure. And then the same thing. So if I, instead of making it a 3x3, I made it a 3x3 1/8 to compensate for it, and I wanted to make sure I wasn't under, well then I would end up with the same situation where I'm still touching one face and not another. So that really is a limitation of the single acting vices. A double acting vise will go ahead and squish in both directions. So I'll get a force that comes into my X, and I'll have another force that comes into the Y. So I actually have to have two cylinders to be able to do that. So that's not what I have. So I've only got one single acting vise. So now the problem is I can't, when this is closed, so I'll go ahead and close it. When this is closed, I can't set it up this way. If it's set up this way, when I turn on the vise doesn't really have anywhere to travel, and that's one problem. The other problem is if it's really that snug, then I have a hard time trying to get it into there. So I actually need to set it out here, and that really is a problem. So when I try to set this up, I need to have the same gap between my material and this side of the jaw and the same gap there. And that's really hard to do when you can't even really see over the top of the part because it's hard to get inside the machine to be able to do it. So I've got a little trick that has worked for me, and you may find something that works a little bit better for you, but I need to get some kind of consistent gap both in the X and the Y. So I might use something like some AAA batteries. So they're fairly small. It'll give me a gap that's consistent. What I'm going to do is go ahead and squish that all the way in as far as it will go. And then this battery will take up what's left on this side. So now when I go ahead and try to line it up, then I can get a consistent distance in both of those sides and then go ahead and mount that down. So far that's been about the best way that I can try to figure that out. So the idea should be when this extends out that it will go ahead and squeeze up against our part. So you can see that I do have quite a bit of travel. So that part's not necessarily an issue. So you could use a AA battery or a AAA battery, something like that. You just want to make sure that the distance that you have between your part is consistent. And do the best that you can when you're making your raw stock to make it as consistent between your X and your Y, or whatever your size is, make sure that they stay consistent. Okay, let's go over to the machine and drop this in and see if we can't go ahead and get it mounted. Okay, let's go ahead and start off with our static jaw. A good majority of the time it's going to sit back here somewhere. And as you take a look at it, I can see that my bolts are not going to hit this slot at all. So my two bolts are going to be in these back two slots. It is a little bit tricky, but you may find out that it's better to put the two T-nuts in the slots first rather than trying to build it on here. So I kind of get them lined up with each other, then I'll drop the bolts through and then do the best I can to try to line it up. It takes a little bit of finagling, and you might find some good little tricks on how to do it, but I'm going to go ahead and mount this in there loosely, and I'll be right back. Okay, so make sure you have good movability in the Y and the X direction before we mount this down. So again, it's going to be kind of around there. I highly suggest when you're setting up your static jaw that you have your material available. So this is the material I'm going to use, this 3x3 block. And I can see right now if this is the middle of the table, I'm not unhappy with that. That's about where I would like that to sit. So that's good. So I'll go ahead and take the material away, and this is where my square comes into place. I'd like to think that both this jaw and this jaw are completely parallel to each other, and that's what makes part of the expense of this jaw, or this setup. But I don't know that for a fact, and it's more important to me that this jaw is perpendicular to the table. And the best thing I have right now is this front edge. So I'm going to go ahead and hook my square onto that front edge of the table and then bring it over to my jaw. Then I'm going to try to line those up the best that I can so that these are perpendicular to each other, which would also make this parallel to my x-axis and then this parallel to my y-axis. So I've got it where I like it, and then I'm going to kind of slowly tighten them up. So get a little bit here, a little bit here, a little bit here. Know that as you're tightening them, you can accidentally twist it. So that's why I leave this all together. And then as I'm tightening it down, I watch to make sure that I'm not moving away from my square. So I'm happy with that one. And I'll do the same thing with this one. Okay, so I'm going to move my square away and then bring it back up to it. So I'm pretty happy with it. And again, without a dial indicator, this is really the next best thing that I can do. Now, I would suggest that you go ahead and snug these up decently tight, because there's going to be quite a bit of pressure that comes up against them. So just give them one more once over. And I don't need to really crank down on them, but I do want them to be decently tight. So give it a pretty good snug and a pull, and see if you can make it twist. And if you can, then redo the process. Okay, so that one is completely set up. I'm going to go ahead and move this stuff away and go ahead and get my other vise. Okay, so I've got all my components, and I'm just going to repeat the process. I'm going to go ahead and slide these two T-nuts in, but I know right now for the setup that I'm going to use, it's not going to be back here. It's going to be out here somewhere, so I'm going to be using these front two slots. Okay, now I can warn you, do the best you can at really letting the bolts find the T-nuts themselves. If it struggles at all, then you could be cross-threading them. And these T-nuts, then you'd have to rebuy again. So that's not necessarily something I can just go to the hardware store and buy. The bolts are fairly easy, but the T-nuts aren't. So we want to do the best that we can to try to not cross-thread those on the bottom. Okay, so now we go through our process of putting our material back in. I'm going to use something as a spacer. I'm going to make sure that my jaw is all the way back, and I'm happy with that. Now I can, if I'm not hooked up at all, I have no air going to it, I can go ahead and just try to pull this out and go up against it, but I don't usually have that situation because I can't keep the door open and not be bleeding air out of here, and that's a whole nother battle. So I'm decently happy with that, but I still want to make sure, as long as these are perpendicular to each other, then this should also be perpendicular to the table. So I'll do that same thing. I'm going to come over, whether it's the inside or the outside of it, that's up to you. But I do want to try to make sure that this one is decently square to the table. So I've got a decent gap. I'm happy with that. I'm decently parallel to the table. I'll go ahead and start snugging them up just a little bit at a time, getting them finger tight. And then I'll go ahead and start putting some more pressure on them. I'll move my square away and then slowly bring my square back up, and I'm pretty happy with that. If not, then I can loosen it back up and I can fix it. So it may be tight to kind of get this out, but that's another part why I like the batteries, because they're cylinders. It kind of rolls out and I can take that out. Okay, we're now ready to go ahead and connect our two air lines to the cylinder. Your question may be, does it matter which one goes to which? Well, yes, it does. So if we go over to the right side of the machine and look at the control panel for the vise, we can see the solenoid actually has two different colored ports. We have a black port and a blue port. So I've gone ahead and connected the blue hose to the blue port and then a black hose to the black port. So now when I come over to the vise itself, I can see that the blue one is actually supposed to go in front, and the black one's supposed to go here. I wish that these two ports were colored, but they're not. So I'm going to go ahead and put the black one here, because this is my extension. So when air comes in, it will actually squeeze it and push it out. And then this one is my retract. So this one will send air into this way and retract it back. Okay, so now it's time to test it. I'm going to go over and actually connect the machine back to the compressor so that I have air to the cylinder. So now that I'm over in CNC Motion or CNC Base, I've made sure that I have the vise in the configuration so it's available, and I have the vise in my simulation so that it's available. So as soon as I click on this button, it should close my vise for me. As I click it again, it should open back up. So I'm going to go ahead and close it. And once you're closed on your material, come in and actually take a look and see if you're actually touching it on both of those faces. If not, we may need to adjust the vise a little bit. You can always go ahead and give your part a good little tug and make sure that it's locked into place. And then I like to take either a rawhide mallet or a soft face mallet, and I like to go ahead and tap down. I want to make sure the part is completely seated either against the table or up against my spacer. So I make sure that it's got a good hold on to it, and I make sure that it's as far down as it can possibly go. And that's all there is to setting up the vise.